June 1944 was approaching, and with it the most anticipated invasion in military history. Yet along the southeastern coast of England, beneath gray skies and drifting salt air, thousands of German intelligence officers stared across the channel and waited for an army that did not exist. They watched for Patton's first United States Army group, the mighty blow that Berlin believed would strike directly at Calais. For months, they had monitored its divisions, its tank battalions, its constant radio chatter. They tracked its supposed movements on maps spread across situation rooms from Paris to Berlin. To the German High Command, this phantom force was as real as any army fielded by the Allies. They had no idea that what they were observing was a masterpiece of deception, built from rubber, imagination, and the Allied determination to mislead Adolf Hitler. The story began long before the beaches of Normandy appeared on any planning table. After the evacuation at Dunkirk, after the fall of France, and after the bitter years when Britain stood almost alone, a new Allied resolve began to take shape. By 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their generals knew the tide of war had turned. The question was no longer if the Allies would invade Western Europe, but where. Hitler expected the blow, but not the form it would take. To land in France was to risk everything. To fail was to ensure the war would grind on for years. The Allies needed not only force, but misdirection. They needed to make Germany look the wrong way. At the center of this effort was the idea of creating a shadow army so convincing that it would occupy the enemy's attention until the very moment the real invasion struck hundreds of miles away. Operation Fortitude was born from this ambition. It blended military strategy with theatrical illusion, combining the precision of intelligence work with the creativity of artists, engineers, and Hollywood designers. Yet the success of the entire plan depended on one critical element. Germany had to believe General George Patton commanded this fictional force. Patton had returned from North Africa with a reputation of being the Allies' most aggressive field commander. His glare, his swagger, his fierce belief in attack over retreat made him terrifying to the enemy and controversial among his own allies. The Germans respected him with an almost superstitious intensity. When Allied planners saw this, they recognized the psychological advantage. If Patton seemed to be preparing for an invasion, Germany would believe it was coming. And so the Americans gave him a role unlike any he had ever played, the leader of the greatest army that never existed. To the Germans, it appeared that the 1st United States Army Group had been steadily gathering around the English counties of Kent and Sussex. A web of radio transmissions hinted at battalions and supply lines. Reconnaissance flights revealed what looked like armored formations parked in fields, rows upon rows of Sherman tanks and half-tracks positioned beneath camouflage nets. Yet the tanks were nothing more than inflated rubber shells, light enough for 2 soldiers to lift, but realistic enough to fool an observer from miles away. The motor pools did not rumble with engines. They hissed with the sound of air pumps as entire regiments of fake vehicles were constructed and repositioned. The deception extended beyond the battlefield scenery. Special effects crews developed wooden airplanes, plywood artillery, and trucks made from canvas and wire frames. They arranged them with precise military geometry so that aerial photographs would reveal an army preparing for war. Every illusion had to withstand not only German analysis, but the scrutiny of seasoned intelligence officers trained to detect the smallest inconsistencies. A single misplaced shadow or mirrored pattern could expose the ruse. The craftsmen working behind the scenes understood that the fate of D-Day might rest on their ability to construct a world that existed only in appearances. Alongside these visual tricks was an even more elaborate deception: the radio war. Allied signal units transmitted endless streams of coded chatter. They simulated the communications of entire divisions, each with its own rhythm, slang, and procedural habits. The operators rotated frequencies to create the impression of constant logistical movement. They sent bogus supply requests, weather reports, and training updates. German intercept units, brilliant in their own right, absorbed every message. They charted trends, built assessments, and prepared elaborate briefings. What they never realized was that they were listening to some of the finest actors in military history. Within the German High Command, confidence in the illusion grew. Their analysts believed they had uncovered the Allies' true intentions. Even Hitler became convinced that the main invasion would fall upon Calais, the shortest crossing between England and France. This conviction became a blindfold. When reports emerged of suspicious troop movements farther west, near the cold gray waters facing Normandy, German officers dismissed them as diversions. They expected Patton to lead the decisive strike. They believed the Allies would choose the obvious path. The deception had taken root so deeply that logic yielded to expectation. Yet while German intelligence sifted through fake reports and phantom armies, the real invasion force gathered in silence. In hidden ports and quiet harbors, ships loaded with men and supplies waited with engines idling. Storm clouds drifted over the channel. Tension settled over Allied command posts like an invisible fog. Eisenhower reviewed his maps again and again, aware that everything depended on Germany remaining fixated on Calais. Every inflatable tank, every forged message, every scripted illusion had bought the Allies time. The question was how long the deception would hold. Meanwhile, in cities occupied by German forces, daily life continued under the weight of war. Civilians scanned newspapers filled with confident predictions of a coming Allied attack at Calais. The propaganda machine fed the illusion, repeating rumors planted by Allied intelligence. German officers reassured their troops that the enemy would strike where they were strongest and most prepared. They pointed to Patton's presence in the southeast as evidence. They believed their defenses were positioned perfectly. In truth, they were preparing for a battle that would never come. The illusion became most powerful because it was rooted in what the enemy already believed. Hitler expected Patton to command the decisive invasion. He believed the Allies would take the shortest route across the Channel. He believed their generals would avoid the marshes and hedgerows of Normandy. Operation Fortitude exploited these beliefs with surgical precision. The Phantom Army flourished because the Germans desperately wanted to believe it was real. As spring turned to summer, the deception reached its peak. Allied intelligence fed German agents false documents. Double agents working for British intelligence provided detailed confirmations of the fabricated divisions gathering under Patton's command. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion. The Germans built new fortifications near Calais. They shifted units into defensive positions. They adjusted artillery ranges. The illusion dictated their strategy. And yet, somewhere deep within the web of German surveillance, doubts began to emerge. Weather patterns, shipping reports, and scattered intelligence hinted at something else forming across the Channel. But by then the deception had done its work. Doubt could not overturn months of reinforced belief. The Germans had committed themselves to defending the wrong shore. As the night of June 5th arrived, Storms swept across the channel. The real invasion force moved through the darkness, slipping past the watchful eyes of radar stations and coastal observers. Hundreds of miles away, the inflatable tanks of Patton's Phantom Army sat quietly beneath the moonlight, unmoving but still deadly in their illusion. They were the silent guardians of the greatest secret of the war. The winds across southeast England carried the scent of the Channel and the rattle of distant machinery as the most unusual army in history took shape. It was the spring of 1944, and in the fields around Kent, Sussex, and the quiet English countryside, an empire of illusions began to rise. It had no steel, no real armor, and no engines to shake the earth. Yet it was destined to deceive one of the most formidable intelligence networks of the war. The Germans would come to believe in it so completely that they would hold back their reserves long after Allied boots were on French soil. This fictional empire was the First United States Army Group, and its commander, at least in the eyes of the enemy, was General George S. Patton. American soldiers who arrived at these secret locations expected to find columns of tanks ready for battle. Instead, they were greeted by fields full of rubber shells lying deflated on the grass. Some resembled half-assembled tents. Others looked like giant discarded toys. Engineers moved between them, carrying air hoses, pumps, ropes, and paint buckets. It was here, among hedgerows and abandoned farms, that the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops turned deception into a military science. The unit itself was unlike anything the Army had fielded before. Its ranks included artists, sound engineers, architects, set decorators, sign painters, and radio specialists. Many had come from the film studios of Hollywood, from advertising agencies, or from art schools. A few had been stagehands or scenic designers. Their resumes made them seem almost out of place in a war zone. Yet the Army understood that defeating the Germans required more than tanks and rifles. It required imagination. Captain Ralph Ingersoll, an intelligence officer helping coordinate the deception, once walked through a field where a line of Sherman tanks was being inflated. The scene was almost comical at first glance. Canvas and rubber stretched into shape as teams pumped air through wide hoses. Soldiers moved quickly, adjusting the angles of turret frames or tightening straps to hold the form steady. A farm gate creaked nearby, chickens pecked at the dirt, and a group of British children watched from the road with wide eyes as the tank slowly came to life. Ingersoll knew that laughter was part of the work. A good illusion always bordered on the absurd until the moment it succeeded. The inflatable vehicles were only one piece of the puzzle. Wooden aircraft were built by carpenters who normally spent their time constructing stage sets for plays. They measured every beam, sanded every edge, and painted them with meticulous care. When viewed from above, these planes appeared indistinguishable from the real machines parked at frontline airfields. German reconnaissance pilots, flying at high altitude, recorded row after row of these wooden fighters and bombers. The illusion was convincing enough to prompt Luftwaffe analysts to mark them as operational squadrons. To make the deception truly effective, the Allies needed more than just objects. They needed evidence of life. Engineers created tire tracks in the mud using weighted rollers shaped like tank treads. They built fake supply depots with crates stacked neatly beneath camouflage nets. They constructed fuel storage areas, complete with imitation pipelines that glistened in the sun. Some soldiers were assigned to walk in specific patterns, creating footpaths on the ground where patrols would have moved. Everything had to appear lived in, used, and ready for battle. The radio specialists played an equally crucial role. They developed the voice of the Phantom Army by crafting detailed radio traffic patterns. Each division within the fictional command had its own operators with unique habits, call signs, and personalities. Messages circulated through the airwaves describing training exercises, equipment shortages, vehicle repairs, disciplinary issues, and supply movements. These transmissions were not random chatter. They were carefully curated stories meant to build the identity of an army that was never seen in person. German intelligence intercepted every signal and charted their origin points. Over time, they formed what appeared to be a clear map of Patton's forces stretching across the southeastern coast. Among the deception units, Corporal Fred Scollins had earned a reputation for improvisation. During one inspection, he noticed a group of wooden jeeps that looked far too clean. The German Air Force was unlikely to believe such pristine equipment belonged to a battle-hardened American unit. Scollins instructed a few soldiers to smear mud across their headlights and scuff the tires with rocks. Another man tossed a bucket of dirty water across the hood, letting it drip and stain like real engine grime. Scollins explained that the enemy's most seasoned photo interpreters were trained to examine shadows and dirt patterns on vehicles. A spotless Jeep would raise suspicion. A dirty one would pass without notice. Nearby, teams of painters worked on large canvas banners, signs, and insignia bearing the fictional symbols of non-existent divisions. These were hung on makeshift buildings and placed near entries to fake command posts. Some were even positioned intentionally where German agents operating in England might see them. Every detail reinforced the same narrative. Patton's army was real, growing, and preparing for the decisive blow into France. The deception extended into the social world as well. Double agents managed by British intelligence delivered reports confirming what the Germans were already seeing from reconnaissance flights. One such agent, known to the Germans as Agent Garbo, sent message after message describing the buildup near Dover. His credibility within German intelligence was so high that even the most cautious analysts accepted his accounts. They believed he had access to privileged Allied information. In reality, every detail he sent was scripted by the British. The Germans swallowed the bait entirely. They monitored the Phantom Army with growing concern. Reports streamed into Berlin stating that Patton was preparing to lead the invasion. Hitler's own distrust of Normandy as a landing site pushed him further into the trap. He insisted that the real invasion would come at Calais. When German officers raised the possibility of a landing elsewhere, Hitler dismissed them. His conviction became the cornerstone of the entire deception's success. Meanwhile, Patton himself understood the role he played. Several months earlier, he had been temporarily removed from command after slapping a soldier in Sicily. His reputation for aggression and unpredictability made him useful in the eyes of Allied planners. Germans feared his command style. They believed he represented the Allies' strongest offensive spirit. To see him stationed near Dover served as confirmation of their assumptions. Patton made sure they saw what they wanted to see. He delivered public speeches, attended highly visible inspections, and appeared in places where double agents could report his presence. He offered the Germans a performance worthy of his reputation, yet while the Germans believed in this phantom empire, Patton himself felt the sting of being sidelined. He longed to return to frontline command. He chafed at playing the role of decoy. In private moments, he paced restlessly, contemplating how history would judge him if his assigned role remained hidden in the shadows of the real invasion. Still, he understood the stakes. The illusion he led would save thousands of Allied lives on the beaches of Normandy. His ego had to become a weapon of war. As May turned to June, the Phantom Empire reached its peak. Airfields brimmed with fake aircraft. Tank battalions of rubber and canvas filled the countryside. Radio traffic echoed across the airwaves like the heartbeat of a massive army. Supply depots swelled with empty crates. Sign painters created new insignia almost daily. Soldiers moved fake trucks under darkness so that aerial observers would track their positions. The illusion expanded so far that even some Allied units who passed through the region believed the army they saw was real. By early June, Allied High Command received confirmation that the deception had worked. German observers remained focused on Calais. They believed Patton's forces would strike there in overwhelming strength. The Phantom Empire had become one of the most successful illusions in military history. As the real invasion force prepared to cross the Channel, Patton's fictional army remained perfectly still. The tanks did not move. The aircraft did not launch. The trucks did not roll. Yet in the minds of German generals, this silent army towered as the greatest threat on the horizon. The empire of rubber and imagination had served its purpose. It was now time for the real battle to begin. Long before dawn, in a dimly lit operations room somewhere outside Paris, a German intelligence officer named Major Ernst Hellmich bent over a table crowded with reports, aerial photographs, and radio intercept transcripts. The light from the lamps cast sharp shadows across his tired face as he traced the outline of southeastern England with a gloved finger. Every line of information converged on one chilling conclusion. The Allied invasion was coming, and it would fall at Calais. For months, all signs had pointed to the same place. Every report, every intercepted message, every reconnaissance photograph seemed to echo the same certainty. What Major Hellmich did not know was that he was reading a script written by the Allies. To understand how Germany became so convinced, one must imagine the perspective from behind the desks of the Abwehr and the Luftwaffe's intelligence branches. These men were skilled, disciplined, and often remarkably perceptive. What doomed them was not incompetence, but conviction. They believed they understood their enemy, and this belief made them vulnerable to manipulation. The Allies, aware of this psychological terrain, planted illusions like seeds and watched them take root in the minds of their adversaries. The first seeds were sown through the aerial reconnaissance photographs. German pilots soared over England in high-altitude aircraft, camera lenses clicking at regular intervals. When they returned to their bases, technicians developed the images in dark rooms, producing sheets of grainy photographs that filled entire tables. Analysts examined each photograph through magnifying glasses, searching for signs of military buildup. They found exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. There, in the fields of Kent, sat the silhouettes of Sherman tanks positioned with the precision expected of armored divisions. A row of them pointed eastward, toward the narrowest part of the channel. In another image, supply depots stretched beneath long camouflage nets, indicating large stockpiles of fuel and ammunition. Wooden aircraft lined runways that appeared recently used, complete with markings that suggested regular takeoffs and landings. The interpreters submitted their findings with professional certainty. These were real armored units, real air wings, and real preparations for a major crossing. The German High Command received these reports with growing concern. The Allies seemed to be concentrating their strongest forces near Dover. This matched perfectly with German expectations. Calais was the shortest route. It was the logical choice. Even if the Allies understood its heavy fortifications, they might attempt a massive breach, believing that speed and surprise could outweigh defensive strength. Hitler, who often made strategic decisions based on intuition rather than military analysis, found his assumptions reinforced at every turn. The deception did not create a fantasy for him. It confirmed what he already believed. Intelligence was not collected through photographs alone. German listening posts along the channel intercepted countless radio messages from across the sea. The radio operators transcribed the codes dutifully, noting patterns, frequencies, and origins. The messages painted the picture of an enormous logistical machine operating in southeast England. Entire divisions seemed to be communicating about supply shortages, movement orders, and training schedules. Signal officers plotted these transmissions on maps using colored pins. As more signals arrived, the pattern solidified. To the Germans, the data indicated at least 50,000 men stationed near Dover, supported by armored battalions and aircraft wings. They calculated how long it would take such a force to embark on landing craft. They measured the tidal conditions that would make a crossing ideal. They prepared contingency plans for counterattacks once the Allies landed at Calais. Every discussion, every briefing, every map exercise revolved around this assumption. Within the German command structure, analysts worked tirelessly to keep pace with the flood of information. Oberstleutnant Franz Ziegler, a signals intelligence officer stationed in Belgium, often spoke privately about his unease. He felt the Allies were giving them too much data, too much visibility into their plans. Yet he dismissed his doubts because the information fit predictions perfectly. It aligned with months of analysis. It appeared consistent. In war, consistency was reassuring, and reassurance was a dangerous comfort. Double agents operating inside Britain became the third pillar of the deception. These agents reported directly to German handlers, feeding them stories of troop buildup and military activity. One such agent, known as Arabelle, but celebrated in German circles as Agent Garbo, sent reports describing military convoys headed toward Dover. He mentioned seeing engineers constructing makeshift docks capable of supporting large-scale embarkations. He described the movement of American units wearing insignia unique to Patton's 1st United States Army Group. He even reported conversations overheard in pubs about soldiers preparing for a major assault. His credibility had been established long before Fortitude began. The Germans trusted him deeply, unaware that British intelligence controlled his every move and wrote every message he sent. As Garbo's reports aligned with radio intercepts and aerial photographs, German confidence swelled. They saw coherence, not choreography. They believed they were decoding the truth. Meanwhile, in Berlin, senior officers held regular briefings. Maps were spread across polished tables. The Channel coastline glowed red under lamps. One staff officer pointed to the concentrations near Dover. Another emphasized that Allied bombers had focused heavily on Pas-de-Calais railway networks, suggesting preparation for an invasion there. Hitler listened intently. He had always felt Normandy was a feint, a diversion meant to draw German forces away from the real target. The evidence now confirmed his suspicions. He concluded that the Allies were preparing to strike at Calais with overwhelming force. General von Rundstedt, overseeing the Western Front, expressed occasional concern about Allied activity near Normandy. He was an experienced soldier who knew the Allies could not be trusted to follow predictable logic. Yet whenever he raised the issue, he was met with reassurances. Reports indicated Patton's continued presence near Dover. Radio intercepts showed steady activity, Reconnaissance flights confirmed the buildup. Hitler himself ordered that panzer reserves remain near Calais until the main invasion was confirmed. Rundstedt knew he could not overrule these directives. Within the German observation posts along the coast, soldiers looked through binoculars across the water on clear mornings. They often spoke of hazy shapes near Dover, shadows that resembled landing craft or armored vehicles. Rumors swirled among enlisted men that the Americans were gathering enormous forces for the coming assault. Their officers reinforced these beliefs, encouraging the idea that they were defending the decisive point of the war. Such psychological reinforcement created certainty among troops at every level. The Germans were preparing for the wrong battle with absolute conviction. The obsession with Calais led to several critical blind spots. When Allied ships began congregating near southern England away from the Dover region, the Germans dismissed these movements as training exercises. When small or inconsistent recon photos from Normandy showed unusual activity, analysts labeled them anomalies. When the French resistance sent scattered reports of increased traffic in Normandy villages, these were ignored as unreliable. The Germans had built a framework of understanding, and any piece of evidence that did not fit was quietly pushed aside. Even after D-Day began, the deception held. On the morning of June 6th, as Allied troops stormed Normandy's shores and chaos erupted across the coastal defenses, German commanders hesitated. Many believed that this could still be a diversion. They expected Patton to lead the real invasion at Calais. Hitler himself refused to release armored divisions, insisting the main assault was yet to come. The Phantom Army still loomed in his mind, more threatening than the forces already on his beaches. Hours passed. Allied troops pushed inland. Yet some German generals continued to argue that Normandy was only the first act. The persistence of the deception was astonishing. Patton's Phantom Empire was so convincing that German intelligence clung to it even when gunfire echoed across France. Major Helmrich, the same officer who had studied the maps in the dimly lit room outside Paris, received frantic reports from Normandy that morning. He listened as field officers screamed through the radio about bombardments, casualties, and chaos. He looked again at the carefully arranged intercepts and photos that had guided his analysis. He reread Garbo's recent reports, confirming troop buildup near Dover. He tried to reconcile the impossible contradiction. Yet his training, his instincts, and the weight of months of consistent intelligence made him hesitate. It was only later, long after the beaches were lost and the Allies were moving inland, that the full scope of the deception became clear. Only then did cracks appear. Only then did some analysts realize they had been watching shadows. But by that time, the Allies were too far ahead. The Germans had seen an invasion that wasn't there. And in believing the illusion, they had allowed the real invasion to succeed. The stage was set for the final act. The Phantom Army had done its work, shaping German decisions at the most critical moment of the war. Now the consequences of that mistaken belief would unfold across the battlefields of France, where the real war advanced with unstoppable momentum. The storm that rolled across the English Channel on June 5, 1944, seemed at first like another obstacle placed by fate to delay the greatest invasion in history. Wind howled across the water, waves battered the sides of ships anchored in the darkness. Rain sliced through the air in thin silver lines. The channel looked more like a graveyard than a passageway to liberation. Yet beneath the turbulent surface of the storm lay a secret, one that would determine the fate of nations. Operation Fortitude had done its work. The Phantom Army had held the German gaze firmly fixed on Calais. Now, in the middle of the night, the real invasion force moved toward Normandy, unnoticed, unopposed, and protected by the greatest deception ever staged in the history of warfare. In an operations room aboard the HMS Apollo, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood quietly as officers read out weather reports, convoy positions, and last-minute intelligence updates. The atmosphere was tense but focused. The Supreme Commander was a man who understood the enormity of what was unfolding. The deception had bought the Allies valuable time, but time was not the same as victory. Eisenhower knew that if the Germans shifted their reserves too quickly, if they realized the truth before the landings fully succeeded, the beaches of Normandy could become a slaughterhouse. Across the Channel, German commanders waited in relative calm. In bunkers along the Pas-de-Calais coastline, officers peered out at the stormy horizon, convinced that no invasion could take place under such conditions. General Friedrich Dollmann, overseeing the 15th Army responsible for defending Calais, had spent the evening reviewing reports confirming Patton's presence near Dover. His staff assured him that the Allies needed clear skies for an amphibious assault. The weather alone convinced him that the invasion would not come tonight, even when scattered reports trickled in from Normandy, hinting at Allied movements. Dollmann dismissed them as diversionary tactics meant to distract German forces from the real threat. Meanwhile, in the German 7th Army headquarters in Normandy, a handful of officers worked through the night with limited staff. Most senior commanders were away from their posts. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. Several officers were attending war games near Rennes. The Germans had been lulled into complacency, not by incompetence, but by the steady, unbroken rhythm of Fortitude's illusions. To them, Normandy remained a lesser concern. When the first Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines after midnight, their descent into the darkness marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Western defenses. Thousands of paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions floated down in the pre-dawn blackness, their canopies snapping like ghostly wings. Some landed far from their objectives because of the storm. Others dropped near enemy positions and engaged in fierce skirmishes immediately upon landing. Their mission was to seize bridges, disrupt communications, and sow confusion. They were the vanguard of an invasion that would shake the foundations of the Reich. By dawn, the full scale of Operation Overlord revealed itself. The horizon lit up with the flashes of naval gunfire. Landing craft surged toward the beaches. American, British, and Canadian troops prepared to storm the coast under relentless enemy fire. The water churned with men, steel, and determination. Yet even as chaos erupted across Normandy, the true brilliance of Fortitude became clear, not in the thunder of battle, but in the eerie silence along the shores of Calais. There, where the Germans believed the decisive strike would come, nothing stirred. No ships gathered. No aircraft swarmed overhead. No armored divisions readied for attack. The Phantom Army had done its work flawlessly. German officers stationed in the region waited for Patton's assault. They scanned the water for signs of movement. When they received reports of Allied landings in Normandy, the initial reaction was suspicion. They firmly believed this was the diversion they had been warned about for months. Hitler, informed of the attacks early on June 6th, reacted with the same conviction. He ordered the Panzer reserves to remain in position near Calais. He demanded confirmation before redeploying them. His mind clung to the belief that Normandy was only the beginning. The real invasion would come where the Allies had supposedly prepared the most soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. That conviction, shaped by months of Fortitude's illusions, held him in place. Back in Normandy, Allied forces paid dearly for every inch of ground. Omaha Beach became a nightmare of machine gun fire, mortar blasts, and rising casualties. Bodies floated in the surf. Medics scrambled through the chaos, shouting for wounded men. Officers struggled to maintain control amid the carnage. Yet the weight of German reinforcements did not fall upon them as swiftly as it should have. Had the panzer divisions moved at once, the Allies might have been crushed before securing the beaches. The success of the landings depended on those crucial hours of hesitation. As the morning wore on, German commanders began to feel the scale of the assault. Reports showed landings at multiple beaches. The numbers seemed far too large for a diversion, yet their instructions remained clear. Calais was the primary threat. Normandy was secondary. Even those who doubted the narrative hesitated to contradict their superiors. The chain of command, strained by conflicting interpretations of the situation, continued to move with dangerous slowness. In Berlin, Hitler gathered his staff and reiterated his belief that the Allies were attempting a complex feint. He believed Patton was waiting to lead the real invasion force across the narrowest part of the Channel. Hitler's fixation on Patton became a strategic blindfold. The Phantom Army, though composed of rubber and canvas, had become more real to him than the divisions storming the beaches of France. While German generals debated, Allied soldiers pressed inland. British troops secured sword and gold beaches. Canadians pushed set successfully from Juneau. The Americans on Omaha, after hours of horror, finally broke through the German defenses and moved beyond the bluffs. The foothold was fragile, but growing stronger with every passing minute. By midday, the German 15th Army at Calais began to grasp the possibility that they had been deceived. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed no meaningful Allied buildup near Dover. Radio intercepts revealed sudden silence from the supposed divisions of Patton's 1st United States Army Group. The illusion was beginning to unravel. Yet the damage was already done. The Germans had lost the most precious resource of all, time. Patton, still playing the role of decoy, spent the day visiting mock encampments, allowing double agents and informants to report his presence. He understood that even a single photograph of him near Dover could reinforce the deception. The man who longed for frontline glory had transformed himself into a living symbol of misdirection. By the late afternoon of June 6th, the German High Command finally issued limited orders to send reinforcements toward Normandy. But the panzer divisions stationed near Calais, the ones with the most firepower and the greatest potential to repel the invasion, remained locked in place under Hitler's orders. They would not move until the morning of June 7th. By then, the Allies had landed 156,000 troops and had begun establishing supply lines. Fortitude's success reached its peak in these crucial hours. German uncertainty grew into alarm. Officers scrambled to understand how they had been so thoroughly misled. Radio operators compared weeks of intercepts. Analysts re-examined aerial photographs. Field commanders demanded clarity. Yet every answer pointed to the same painful truth. They had prepared for an army that never existed. They had built defenses for a battle that would never come. As the sun set on June 6th, smoke drifted across the beaches of Normandy. Fires burned in the distance. Ships continued to unload waves of men and equipment. The Allied foothold was tenuous but secure. Eisenhower received reports from across the landing zones. Casualties were high, far higher than many estimates. Yet the momentum of the invasion held. The deception had granted the Allies the narrow window they needed. Across the Channel, the silent fields near Dover lay untouched. The inflatable tanks cast long shadows under the evening light. Wooden aircraft sat motionless on fake runways. Empty trucks made of canvas and wire frames remained parked beneath their nets. These objects, worthless in combat, had just played a decisive role in shaping the outcome of the greatest amphibious operation in history. They were relics of a deception that had saved countless lives. In the days that followed, as the Germans finally realized the truth, frustration and disbelief spread through their ranks. Officers argued over how they had missed the signs. Analysts questioned their assumptions. Hitler grew increasingly agitated, blaming his intelligence services. But the truth was clear. They had been defeated not only by Allied firepower, but by Allied imagination. Operation Fortitude had paid off with devastating effectiveness. The Phantom Army had done its work. The deception that fooled an entire nation shaped the course of the war, allowing the real soldiers of Operation Overlord to carve a path into France. The day the deception paid off was the day the tides of history turned irrevocably toward Allied victory.